Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. You know, as a representative of Kansas' 4th Congressional District, I'm honored to represent many farmers and ranchers in Kansas. You know, agriculture is a major economic industry in my home state. Kansas is #1 producer of wheat and sorghum and #3 producer in cattle and beef processor in the United States. Agriculture trade is a key way the Sunflower State connects with the rest of the world, including Sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, in 2023, Kansas exported goods valued at $294 million to Sub-Saharan Africa. Last fall, I visited Ethiopia and Rwanda to engage in and advance discussions on trade with the United States, among several other items. And Kansas wheat farmers recently returned from a trade mission to Sub-Saharan Africa, where they were seeking to bolster the relationship between the United States and the region in hopes of strengthening and expanding access to the international markets. Kansas ag producers benefit from open markets and free and fair trade, and hopefully renewal of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, will help expand market access. It's crucial that we have these conversations now so that we can renew AGOA before it lapses next September. Mr. Rundy, in renewing AGOA, how can we assure fair market access commitments for U.S. agricultural products?
Thank you, Congressman. I do think that a couple of things. There's been some issues around pork and chicken, in particular in certain countries in Africa, and specifically South Africa. I know a number of pork producers have expressed concern about that. AGOA has the ability to resolve, it has in it the resolution of bilateral trade disputes as one of the reasons by which they qualify for AGOA benefits. So if we have bilateral trade disputes in agriculture, we ought to be using AGOA qualification as saying, hey, you know, if you want to qualify, let's try and work this out. I also think it certainly seems to me that AGOA has provisions that to require that barriers to U.S. exports are eliminated, including unjustified sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. I also think that if those don't work, we ought to think about WTO formal complaints, specifically in the case of, say, South Africa. And then finally, I've heard some good things about supporting more support for some of the USDA agricultural export promotion programs. So I think all of those things would be things I would consider, Congressman.
Yep. Well, thank you. And obviously, one of the key goals we have with AGOA is how do we move the AGOA countries from the preferential program to quote unquote graduate and be part of stronger reciprocal trade agreements. How are countries ready to make this jump, and how can we get more countries to do that?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that we need to fix the concept of graduation. In my testimony, I said countries like Mauritius are now middle-income countries, and you basically graduate to nothing, which is terrible. When this was originally envisioned 25 years ago, the idea was this was a halfway house until we could develop free trade agreements with bilateral countries or with regions the way we have with CAFTA-DR in Latin America. I would hope, as I said in my testimony, that we would begin again to have bilateral free trade agreements in Africa. I think we should begin free trade agreement negotiations with Kenya immediately, and I also think we should be thinking about regional trade agreements with West, Southern, and East Africa. Thank you, Congressman.
Yeah, I mean, that's we kind of undercut a little bit of the value of AGOA without following up with that those bilateral trade agreements once we're done. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, one of the countries I visited last fall was Ethiopia, whose AGOA status was terminated in 2021 due to violations stemming from a civil war in the Tigray province, or Tigray region. This is obviously jeopardized growth and investment in the region, and that followed the most recent AGOA renewal in 2015. Obviously, Ethiopia, as part of the discussions that I had there, as well as others, would like to have that reinstated and is working to address those issues. Obviously, there's lots of concerns as you have rebel activity, and that happens scattered throughout the world. Given some of the heightened risk and instability, how do we make sure that we make countries recognize the value and be more participative? So are there ways we can strengthen AGOA to help with that certainty and help make it more attractive, Mr. Runde, for other countries to participate?
So in my testimony, I talked about that we ought to be, there's some improvements. I think the Coons-Rich bill has some examples of some specific improvements around trade. I also think we ought to be looking at some specific initiatives around digital and mining, and we ought to use our foreign assistance in some ways to kind of be wraparounds to AGOA. Ethiopia is a really big country. We can't ignore it. We've often relied on it as sort of as a security partner in that part of the world, and so I'm hoping that we can get to a better place with Ethiopia at some point.
Thank you. And free and fair trade is such an important part for the world. It's lifted more people out of poverty over the last 70 years, and we want to continue to have that.
Trade in the private sector, what lift people out of poverty, but foreign aid is a supporting actor in this, but the real actor is the private sector.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.